Good Shabbat, everybody. Welcome to the sacrament of Shabbat. My name is Bishop Bryan Mosser, and in this series, we're talking about the book of Isaiah. This is part 23 of a series, and if you're new, please feel free to join our YouTube channel or to join our Facebook page and follow along there, and you can catch up with the earlier classes in this series. So now we're on Isaiah chapter 27. So here, the Lord slays Leviathan, which is very interesting because a lot of Christians, we grow up in different Christian sects and we're not really taught too deeply the Old Testament. Unless you're really like in an evangelical church or, more of a Protestant church, they may have a little bit more emphasis in Old Testament, but often they ignore parts they don't understand, or they try to make Isaiah, for example, predict Jesus's birth and that he's the Messiah, which it never does. And I invite you to prove me wrong by watching all the earlier classes in this series, because Isaiah never predicted Jesus's coming. All prophets prophesied for the benefit of the people of their time. They were meant to bring people that had strayed away from the way of God back into the fold of God. So any prophecy that Isaiah or any other prophet would have made was meant for the people of that time to see the prophecy come to pass so that they knew that God was with them. Emmanuel, God is with us. And that is the proof of any prophecy in any age, is to show that God is with us, that he's not absent, but he's present in every molecule of space, and he knows, his omniscience knows our hearts and our minds. So one thing that I was never taught about for sure in Catholic school, I was born Roman Catholic, was about Leviathan. And it's a fascinating thing because he comes up in different parts of Jewish religion. In Judaism, he comes up in the Talmud and other sources other than the canonical Hebrew Bible, what is called the Old Testament. I prefer Hebrew Testament. Old Testament is a pejorative or demeaning name, because the idea was that it's the Old Testament because this New Testament now replaces your old way of thinking. And that's not what it is. Jesus was a Jew, and the Hebrew Bible would have been his Bible. And his halakha, or his way of interpreting Torah for his disciples, had a very revolutionary aspect to it. But it was still based in his understanding of Torah, which is the Hebrew Bible, and what he felt was God's laws and what he felt the prophecies were overstepping, because the prophecies were a legalistic sect of Judaism, and they would interpret the law in a legalistic, lawyerly way. And Jesus felt that they interpreted it too legalistically, too strictly, too by the letter, and he felt that it should be followed more from the heart. Because Jesus also knew that none of the scriptures are written by God. They're written by people, and how people's thoughts about God were, and how those thoughts develop over time. And I always say in earlier classes, and I'll beat the drum every day, that Judaism is one of the most brilliant of all world religions because it evolved. It allowed itself to evolve. There's part of the Hebrew religion that we'll talk about today that predates the Hebrew Bible, right? So it's very ancient, the roots of the Hebrew religion that became Judaism. And what we start seeing in the Hebrew Testament is a very vengeful, wrathful warrior God, Yahweh. And it makes sense because the Jews of that time, there was wars going on all the time. They were invading empires, kingdoms that would enslave them. They say Egypt enslaved them, even though there's no historical record of Egypt having enslaved the Jews. It's at least part of Jewish scriptural memory. And we do have evidence that the Babylonians took over the Jewish people. They exiled them. They destroyed the first temple. And then the Persians took over the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great, who was the emperor of Persia, allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild Jerusalem, and make a second temple. And this is all covered in the book of Isaiah. We've already talked about it. but just a little bit of a decoder. So in this time, Isaiah really speaks of a wrathful God, and we see that again today. He's a wrathful God. We are learning about God's justice and God's mercy. These are the two things that we'll be talking about in this chapter. The overarching theme is that Isaiah, at this point, in this part of the book of Isaiah, which is really 3 books put together, only the first book was written by Isaiah. There's Deutero and Trito Isaiah, which start from chapter 35 onward, that Isaiah did not write. But what we're reading right now was written by the historical Isaiah. And he was in a time where there's a lot of war, a lot of death, a lot of suffering for the Jewish people. And when people are going through that, they are going to call upon a God that will bring vengeance, that will bring destruction, that will slay people. So you see this very violent God in the first 35 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And God itself means goodness. So how could goodness ever be violent, right? So we always have to be careful. And this is something that I'll say until I die. Be careful how you define God, because how you define God gives you permission to act likewise in the world. If you believe in a wrathful God, it's okay to be wrathful. If you believe in a God that kills women and children and innocent people, then that gives you permission to do the same, because if God is the epitome of my belief system, if that is the ultimate good, then that's how I should behave, that's what I should be like. And that was something revolutionary that later Jewish sages, including Jesus, developed over the course of time, was that God was love. Isn't that interesting? You go from the book of Isaiah, which shows a very wrathful God, a very just God, a very legalistic God. You do what I say, you obey my law, and you will live. You disobey my law, my Torah, and I'm going to destroy you. That's what Yahweh says all through the book of Isaiah. That's really heavy, because there's no one among us that could fulfill the law. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to forget. There's hundreds of mitzvot, they're commandments. And it's impossible to do them all perfectly. But Jesus came along at a certain point in history, Mar Yeshua, as we call him, the Master Jesus. He came along, and his disciple, John, wrote in one of his epistles, he defined God much differently based off of his lessons received from the Master Jesus. And he said, God is love. And that's so important. It shifts the whole paradigm of human behavior and human evolution. And we have Jesus to thank for that in large part, as well as other masters from other traditions and religions that spoke similarly. When you say that God is love, when you define God as love, that the epitome of all creation is love, pure love, then we are obliged to reflect God in the world. What God does in heaven, we should do on earth. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right? So we should reflect God's goodness and pure love in the world. And that's what Jesus taught. So we have to understand that there were some ideas about God that change over time. And that's the way it should be. 1,000 years from now, we should still be evolving our thoughts about God, because even if we meditated and prayed for 24 hours a day, all of our life, there'd still be something new to learn, something new to experience, something new to understand, because God is infinite. We are trying to approach the infinite pure consciousness, which we call Father, which we call Adonai, which we have called Yahweh. Yeah. Jesus called it Abba, which means father, mother, literally both. Ab is father, ba is a feminine suffix. So it's a father, mother, a blended being. So God is both father and mother. And we'll talk about that in a bit in today's lessons. But I just wanted to say that oftentimes in these lessons, you'll see me push back a little bit on Isaiah. But Isaiah is working with what he understood, with what he was experiencing in his culture, with what the Jewish people were experiencing at that time. And when he saw violence all around him, all he could do is invoke God to protect him, to create justice. But what was unfortunate is that that justice and that violence wasn't just invoked against true enemies that were really hurting the Jewish people. It was also inflicted on the Jewish people and their psyche also. So let's look at chapter 27. The Lord slays Leviathan. Again, kind of got off topic, but Leviathan is a topic that most Christians don't know about. So let's learn about it. It'll become very familiar very quickly, right? So we have Isaiah 27:1. On that day, the Lord, with his cruel and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. Very strong imagery. We see this serpent-like being, this demon-like being called Leviathan. It sounds a lot like who in Christianity? Satan, right? They even call him the dragon. And what happens? You know, there's a big fight in Revelation between Saint Michael and Satan, the devil. And Saint Michael hurls him down into the pits of hell. So we see some parallels here between ancient Jewish ideas and later developments in Christianity. So one way of understanding Leviathan is that he was a precursor of Satan. Because we have to remember, just in the book of Job, which was the last book we discussed before Isaiah, Shaitan, or Satan, was an archangel of God. He was not the devil. He became the devil over time in Christianity, but he wasn't so. He was actually an archangel of God's divine justice. So at this point in history, around the same time, more or less, we have the idea of Leviathan in the Hebrew Testament in several places. And we see it in Talmudic literature also. And this being was a demonic force that was living in the sea. And what is the sea? The sea is the human mind, isn't it? Yeah. The sea is the human mind. Waves, storms in the sea represent anxiety, anger, depression, endless thoughts, nervousness, so on and so forth. And that mind, that sea is stirred up by our emotions. So we want to always focus on God as love and reflect God's love in the world to calm the mind. And within this ocean, this churning of emotion, thought, anxiety, depression, worry, we have this demon, this dragon, this serpent, Leviathan, that twists and flees throughout the ocean of this mind. And that represents our bad thoughts, words, and deeds. It represents what we have to purify. And that was Jesus's main teaching. Purify your heart so that you become worthy of spiritual rebirth into the Baranash, or the Son of Mankind Messiah. So this Leviathan is the same basic concept as Satan, what became Satan in later Christianity. He was a demon and he represented all that was chaos, all that was dark, all that was evil. And we'll see that he was able to consume evil souls. So what is the Leviathan? The Leviathan is a sea serpent demon noted in theology and mythology. It is referenced in several books of the Hebrew Bible, including Psalms, the book of Job, the book of Isaiah, and the pseudepigraphical book of Enoch. The Leviathan is often an embodiment of chaos, threatening to eat the damned when their lives are over. In the end, it is annihilated. God annihilates it. As you could see here in this picture, in the last verse, it was said that Yahweh had this poetic sword in which he slayed Leviathan. And so here we see this anthropomorphic Yahweh in the heavens with a sword, and he's attacking Leviathan that's coming up out of the sea, which represents hellish consciousness, the hellish mind. And later on, you see very similar imagery that is replicated and plagiarized by John of Patmos, who wrote Revelation. And the man that wrote Revelation is not the same one as John the Beloved. It's two different Johns. So we can read a little bit more about Leviathan if you like on Wikipedia. So next we come into a whole other imagery. So on this day, what is this day? On that day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan. What day? The day of the Lord, which is Judgment Day, in which God judges both the living and the dead, and there's a resurrection of the dead. And those that followed law, they go to a good place. Those that were disobedient and do not follow Torah, they are destroyed, utterly destroyed. So again, chapter 27 is talking about the idea of the cataclysmic end of the world, which was a belief, because everything is falling apart in Jewish life at this time. The whole world is falling apart. They're literally praying, God, please just make all of this end. Please take us good people with you and just destroy all this evil. That was all they could think from the constant suffering they were in. So they imagined this day of the Lord in which a trumpet would blow and God would have judgment day, and all souls, whether living or dead, would be judged. There'd be a resurrection of the dead, and then there would be judgment. Divine justice would be rendered. Those that were good would be able to go to Jerusalem and live with God on Mount Sinai on this earth, in this terrestrial sphere. This wasn't some spiritual heaven. It was literally heaven coming down to earth, because Yahweh would establish his throne on Mount Sinai. And then Mount Zion, pardon me, not Sinai, Mount Zion, he would establish his throne. You'll see that at the end of this chapter again. And so God would establish his rule on earth in Jerusalem. And those that made a return to the way of God, or had always kept the way of God, that had fidelity with the way of God and Torah, they would be able to live with him on Mount Zion, or at least come to visit his throne on Mount Zion. And all those that did not would be destroyed. And it did not sound like fun. So here we are, the Lord's pleasant vineyard, Isaiah 27, 2-4. On that day, which is the day of Lord, Judgment Day, a pleasant vineyard, sing about it. I, the Lord, Yahweh, am its keeper. Every moment I water it. I guard it night and day so that no one can harm it. I have no wrath. If it gives me thorns and briars, I will march to battle against it. I will burn it up. That's some bipolar stuff here we're attributing to God, right? So on that day, we're talking about Judgment Day, the day of the resurrection, according to Judaic idea. This is not Jesus coming in a second coming. Again, that second coming of Jesus was plagiarized by Paul from this Isaiah motif of the day of the Lord that we're reading about. Christianity stole and appropriated a lot of Jewish ideas. But the idea here is that, just imagine it, think about it. There's going to be a pleasant vineyard, a place of divine ambrosia where you can get drunk on the bliss of God in my divine presence. And I'm the keeper of this literal heaven on earth, which is Israel. And every moment I water it. and I guard my children day and night who are obedient to me. And I have no wrath with them, no anger towards them. But if in that pleasant vineyard, Israel, if it gives me thorns and briars, I will march to battle against it. I will burn it up. So this second part refers to those that do not follow the way of God. They are thorns in God's side. They will not listen. They will not follow the law. They will not follow the rules. They're disobedient children. Well, I'll just burn them up. I'll just destroy them. And this theme we've talked about many times in prior chapters. If you're with God, God is happy with you. If you're disobedient, then God is going to destroy you. So this is God's justice. You have to follow my way. You have to follow the rules. You have to follow the Torah, which literally means the law. If you're not following that, and it's right here in writing, then you deserve to be destroyed, utterly burned up, slayed by enemy armies, enslaved by different empires. This is what they have God say throughout the book of Isaiah, and in many ways, in many places in the Hebrew Testament. And it's because these patriarchs of Judaism grew up in a very violent time, and they needed to keep things under control. So in order to keep violence subdued, they used a worship of God that embodied fear. And it wasn't until the intertestamental literature arose and the time of Jesus came that there's a shift from fearing God to loving God. And there's still a healthy amount of fear of God in most Christian sects, which actually goes against Jesus's teaching, because John was Jesus' disciple, and he learned through his teachings from Jesus that God is love. Well, if God is love, we should approach him with love. We should worship him with love. We shouldn't fear our divine parent. But anyhow, in Judaism, they were taught to fear God, a wrathful God, a just God. And if you did not follow the law, then you could expect to be punished, just cut off from God entirely, which became the Christian idea of hell. So the vineyard in Isaiah 27, 2-4, is the restored Israel, a place for the holy remnant to live and flourish and to be protected by God. It was believed by Isaiah that only a small amount of Jewish people were actually had fidelity with the way of God, actually did the Torah. And they were called the Holy Remnant. And God was meant to destroy all the other Jews that were not faithful to the Torah and to Yahweh. And then from this Holy Remnant would be grown a restored Israel, would be a restoration of Israel, both politically and religiously, through this holy remnant that was obedient to God, that obeyed the way of God, that embodied all the commandments, the mitzvah of Torah. The guilt of Jacob. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Isaiah 27:9. Therefore, by this, the guilt of Jacob will be expiated. And this will be the full fruit of the removal of his sin, when he makes all the stones of the altars like chalk stones crushed to pieces. No sacred poles or incense altars will remain standing. So one of the major things that Jacob did that was a sin was that he deceived his father. He took away Esau's blessing that was meant for him. So it was a type of deception. It was a lie. He was guilty of lying to both his elder brother and his father, deceiving his family, so that he can get a special blessing from his father before he died. And I'm sure Jacob, like everybody else, made plenty of mistakes in his life. And here it's saying, Yahweh is saying that the guilt of Jacob, the sins of Jacob, will be expiated or eliminated if he destroys altars of different religions that the Jewish people were flocking to. Because all in Israel and around Israel were many religions, and sometimes those religions mixed. because they were nomadic people. So you might have an idea, and then you might settle in this village that practices things a little differently. And there were many different religions and variations that were similar. And the early Hebrew religion that predates patriarchal Judaism had a divine mother. I mean, it's very notable when you look at Hinduism and Buddhism and a lot of different earlier religions that predate Judaism. You see a form of the divine mother or a goddess. And it's very marked that Judaism, at least what we are taught of Judaism in the Hebrew Bible, that there is no mother. But what on this earth does not come from a mother? What on this earth is born not of a mother? 99.9999999% of the time, a baby is born from a mother. So God has a feminine aspect, and that was very much erased by patriarchal Judaism, especially during the prophetic period. In the period predating the prophetic literature, which includes Isaiah, the first book of the prophets. Predating that, you'll see a lot of stuff about Asherah and Chokhmah, which are different divine names. Ruach, which is the spirit, which later on became Ruach Kodesh, which is the Holy Spirit of Jesus. So you see all these different religions and names of gods that they demonized. Like Baal was a god of a different culture outside of Judaism, and they made Baal a demon. So that's what both Judaism and later on Christianity did, is that they demonized other cultures' gods. So here, it is thought that the guilt of Jacob, the sins of Jacob, could be expiated if he just crushed all the altars of any religion within Israel that was being practiced other than Yahwehism, the Judaism of the time of Isaiah. So it said that his job was to crush the altars to pieces of opposing or competing religions or mixed religions even, and their incense altars, and specifically that there should be no sacred poles. And if you're reading this, you're like, what the heck is a sacred pole? Well, the sacred pole was a symbol of the divine mother goddess in the Hebrew religion predating patriarchal Judaism. And it was only in the time of the prophets that God became distinctly male only. It became a patriarchal religion from something that was very matriarchal earlier. So we have the goddess Asherah. The Hebrew goddess is erased. Up here in the upper left-hand corner is an image of Asherah. And here in this bottom right picture here, you see this pole, which looks more stone-like. And this pole represents Asherah. And this pole is in Alexandria. In these modern times, it still exists. But as you'll find out, most of the poles were made of wood in the old days. So they could be burned, or they would just become dilapidated and rot over the course of decades and centuries, etc. So there aren't many poles that exist that are dedicated to Asherah. And we don't know much about these poles. But I do recommend reading this great book called The Hebrew Goddess. It's by Raphael Patai. And he has a lot of really great books that anybody wanting to understand the historical teachings of Jesus and his ideas, which are rooted in ancient Judaism, all of Raphael Patai's books are very good to read. In particular, this Hebrew Goddess book, because we see that there was a divine mother in Judaism before she was crushed out intentionally by the prophetic movement, very specifically. So here we have quotes from Patai's book, The Hebrew Goddess. The feminine principle was conceived by the biblical Hebrews and their successors, the Jews of the Hellenistic, Talmudic, and Kabbalistic periods. We begin so as to proceed in chronological order with the goddess Asherah, who was the earliest female deity known to have been worshipped by the children of Israel. All you have to do is read the Hebrew Testament, and you'll see her name pop up all over the place. She was definitely worshipped by the children of Israel. Going on here with this quotation, the beginnings of the period in which Asherah was worshipped, we are dealing with here go back to the time following the arrival of the Israelite tribes to Canaan. For about 6 centuries thereafter, that is to say, down to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the Hebrews worshipped Asherah. And remember that this was something that Isaiah prophesied. So this is during the time of Isaiah right now that we're talking about. So it wasn't until the time of Isaiah, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE, that the Hebrews stopped worshiping Asherah. It was forbidden to worship Asherah. So, of course, all these divine goddess cults went underground. They couldn't publicly worship Asherah, but they did underground. So again, for about 6 centuries thereafter, down to the destruction of Jerusalem, the Hebrews worshipped Asherah, and next to her also other, originally Canaanite gods and goddesses, in most places and times. Only intermittently, although with gradually increasing intensity and frequency, did the prophetic demand for the worship of Yahweh as the one and only God make itself be heard, and was it heeded by the people. Therefore, however large was the number of the carved wooden poles or statues that represented the goddess Asherah and around which her communal worship took place. So her worship would happen around this sacred pole or around different depictions or sculptures of her. So Jacob could be purified of his sin by Yahweh if he destroyed all altars to other gods and goddesses that Hebrew men and women were worshiping. And there's a particular very distinct attack on Asherah, because it mentions to have none of these poles survive. So very interesting. If you want to learn more about how the ancient Hebrew religion worshipped forms of the Divine Mother and how that was ultimately exterminated by patriarchal Judaism, particularly in the prophetic period, then I highly recommend this book, The Hebrew Goddess by Raphael Patai. I really love it. The trumpet is blown on the day of the Lord, Isaiah 27:13. And on that day a great trumpet will be blown, and those who are lost in the land of Assyria and those who are driven out to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem, Mount Zion. So on that day, that resurrection day, that day of judgment, when the angel will blow the trumpet and the dead shall rise, those that followed the way of God will go to God. They will go to the holy mountain at Jerusalem. They'll be able to see God on his throne on Mount Zion. Especially those who are lost, who died in the land of Assyria, meaning during the Babylonian exile. When the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem, obviously they killed a lot of Jews. So, and those who are driven out to the land of Egypt, who died in Egypt, they will come in resurrected form to worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. All martyrs of God. So it's a very interesting chapter, a very powerful chapter to contemplate on. And I invite you to read it the whole way through, because there's a whole section in between these opening verses and this ending verse that I've spoken of. There's a very poetic expression of God's favor on those that are obedient to him and how he will very ruthlessly destroy those who do not follow Torah. So it's interesting to reflect on that and how that makes you feel, and to consider what I've taught in this lesson about that. Do you agree with that? Do you not agree with that? Know that when you listen to these lessons, you don't need to agree with me at all. You're free to have your own ideas. That's encouraged. So reflect on it and see what you think. Does it make sense? It only makes sense if you understand the time that Isaiah lived in and what the Jewish people were suffering at that time. Second cup of blessing. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother of the Universe, please help us to always seek you in love, not in fear. May we express your love on this earth. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I hope to see you on Sunday for the Liturgy of the Chalice, our Eucharistic celebration. Have a very joyful, peaceful Shabbat, and I will see you next Friday. Good Shabbat, everybody. Thank you.